Hello everyone, we are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We'll be learning today Miras Hashem Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Yom HaKippurim, and we begin a brand new Siman today, Siman Taf Reish Ches, Seder Seudah hamafsekes, the halachas that pertain to the seudah hamafsekes, Uboy Dalet Seifim, and here we have 4 Seifim. We are on Ayin Gimel Amid Beis. Says the Mishnah Berurah Siman Taf Reish, says the Mechaber Siman Taf Reish Ches Sif Aleph. Oichlim. Well, in the previous Siman Taf Reish Zayin, we learned the halachas that pertain to davening mincha on Erev Yom Kippur. So now here in Taf Reish Ches, the Mechaber begins Sif Aleph, and he says, Oichlim. After mincha, we're going to eat. We're going to eat the seudah hamafsekes. The seudah hamafsekes is called the seudah hamafsekes, the seudah that interrupts, because this is the seudah that's going to interrupt between chayil, between weekday, when we can eat, and between Kodesh, between Yom Kippur, when we no longer eat. So this is the seudah of interruption. This is the seudah when we're going to stop eating. Once we finish the seudah hamafsekes, we're not going to eat. So oichlim, we eat the seudah hamafsekes, umafsikim, and we have to stop eating koidem bein hashmashos, before the onset of bein hashmashos. Bein hashmashos is the twilight period. That's between day and night. It's safek yom, safek laila. So of course, during Ben Hashmashos, we're not allowed to eat, because that would be a safek daraisa. Safek daraisa, we have to go lechumra. So certainly you cannot eat during the Ben Hashmashos time. The Mechaber tells me here that we have to stop eating koidem Ben Hashmashos. We have to stop eating before the onset of Ben Hashmashos. Why? Shetzarech lahaisif mechayel al hakodesh. Because there is a chiyuv to add on to the kodesh from the chayil. So we cannot just fast on Yom Kippur itself, from the second Yom Kippur begins until the second Yom Kippur ends. We have to be moisif from the chayil onto the kodesh, and we have to be noyig kedusha, we have to be noyig fasting already during the week, during the chayil, before Yom Kippur actually begins. And the truth is that this pertains not only to the question of eating, but this pertains also to the other 4 of the Chamish Inuyim. So during the time of the tosefes, we're not allowed to wear shoes, you're not allowed to have tashvish hamita, you're not allowed to have rechitza, you're not allowed to have sicha. So all of the Inuyim of Yom Kippur begin a little bit before the onset of Yom Kippur. So to malacha, you're not allowed to do malacha before the onset of Yom Kippur. You have to be moisef mechayel al hakodesh. Continues the Mechaber, and the Mechaber says, "V'tosefes zeh," this amount of time that we have to add on, ein lo shiur. It doesn't have a fixed amount of time. El, or rather, koidem bein hashmashos, before the onset of bein hashmashos, shezmanoi elef hakamesh meyos ama koidem halayla. When is the beginning of bein hashmashos? And we're going to get into this in greater detail when we see the Mishnah Berurah. But the Mechaber says, when does bein hashmashos start? Bein hashmashos starts the amount of time it takes to walk 1,500 amos before nightfall, before the beginning of night. And again, we'll get into greater detail on this. So what the Mechaber is telling me is, we have the time period of bein hashmashos. Bein hashmashos is safek yom, safek laila. So during bein hashmashos, we certainly cannot eat, do malacha, or do any other of the chamish inuyim. Now we have a chiyuv to be moisef mechayel ala kodesh, which says that before the beginning of bein hashmashos, we have to be moisef a certain amount of time, which the Mechaber says there is no fixed amount of time. A little bit, a lot, but we have to be moisef mechayel ala kodesh. And the Mechaber identified for us, when does bein hashmashos begin? So the Mechaber said bein hashmashos begins the amount of time it takes to walk 1,500 amos before night. That's when bein hashmashos begins. So let's first see Ois Katan Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go mikal ala kaved. Let's first discuss what's simple, and then we'll go into what's more complicated. So in Ois Katan Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah says, the Mechaber said shetzarech lahaisif. The Mechaber told us this halacha that we have to be moisif from the chayil on the kodesh. What's the source of that? Says the Chavetz Chaim. First of all, you should know the tosefes zeh. This time period where you're being noig, when you're being noig iser, when you're adding from chayil onto the kodesh, ein boy kares. We know chas v'chalila, if somebody eats on Yom Kippur, the einish for that is kares. How about if you eat during the time period of tosefes? Are you chayiv kares if chas v'chalila somebody eats during that time period? Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. But tosefes ein boy kares ki a mitzvah saseh. The time period of tosefes Yom Kippur, that is only based on a chiyuv aseh. There's a positive commandment that you must be moisef mechayil ala kodesh, but there is no iser kares during that time period. And let's go further. It says the Chavetz Chaim, first of all, how do you know that there's a chiyuv aseh? Where does this chiyuv come from, that you have a chiyuv to be moisef mechayil ala kodesh? Says the Chavetz Chaim, the Alfinon b'Gemara, this is learnt out from the Gemara, Rosh Hashanah, Daf Tes Amud Aleph, Midiksiv, since it says in the Pasuk regarding Yom Kippur, V'inisem es nafshaysechem, you will pain yourselves, B'tisha lachodesh, on the 9th of the month, I'm translating the Pasuk literally, B'tisha lachodesh, on the 9th of the month, Ba'erev, in the evening, May Erev ad Erev, from one evening till the next evening, Tishbesu Shabbatchem, you'll be noyeg Shabbos, you'll be noyeg in Isser Malacha. Varminan, and the Gemara says, well, based on this pasuk, Yochel, you would have thought, B'tisha Misanin, you would have thought that you have to fast on the 9th day of Tishrei. After all, what did the pasuk say? The pasuk said, B'tisha lachodesh, on the 9th of the month. So a literal translation of the pasuk would seem to yield that you have to fast on the 9th of Tishrei. Talmud Loimar, to teach us not that way, the pasuk says ba'erev, in the evening. So it's the evening after the 9th of Tishrei, which means the 10th of Tishrei. Now the Gemara says, wait a second, ba'erev, if you're telling me that the fast does not begin until nightfall, until erev after the 9th of Tishrei, so then Yochel Mishatachshach. So that would tell me, when does the fast begin? When does Yom Kippur begin? Nightfall after the 9th of Tishrei. So that means it begins precisely at the beginning of the 10th of Tishrei. Talmud Loimar, B'tisha. In order to teach me not that way, that's why the pasuk said B'tisha. So basically, we have two conflicting words over here in the pasuk. On the one hand, the pasuk says B'tisha, which means that the fast should be on the 9th. On the other hand, we have the word ba'erev, betisha ba'erev, which comes to tell me that it's not on the 9th. It's the night after the 9th, which means the 10th. But it said betisha. So how do we reconcile betisha and ba'erev? So the Gemara asks this question, ha'ketzad, how do we reconcile this? And the Gemara says, maskil u'mis'ane mi ba'oid yoim. The answer is that we're going to begin to fast on the 9th of Tishrei. We're going to be moisef mechayil al hakodesh, and we're going to begin the fast on the 9th of Tishrei, even though the Iker Tainus is tomorrow on the 10th of Tishrei. Kedei lahoisef mechayil al hakodesh. We do this in order to be moisef, to add from the chayil onto the kodesh. And now the Mishnah Berurah says, "V'gam b'yitziyasai moisef miniksiv me'erev ad erev." The same halacha of tosefes applies not only in the beginning of Yom Kippur, that you have to be moisef on the beginning of Yom Kippur, you also have to be moisef at the end of Yom Kippur. Matzah Yom Kippur, you can't eat right away, the second Yom Kippur is over. You have to be moisef a little bit after the end of Yom Kippur. So in this piece of Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah gave us the source for tosefes Yom Kippur, and at the beginning of this Mishnah Berurah, he also told me a very important halacha. He told me that during the time period of the tosefes, during the time period of the tosefes, there is no iser krisis, there's no chiyuv krisis should somebody eat. How do you know that? The truth is that the Gemara learns that out from the pasuk as well. The pasuk learns out from the words be'etzem hayoyim hazeh, that the chiyuv krisis is only on the Iker day of Yom Kippur. The chiyuv krisis is only on the 10th of Tishrei precisely, not during the tosefes period. Okay. So we have over here so far, the Mechaber established for us that there's a chiyuv of tosefes Yom Kippur, that we have to start the isurim of Yom Kippur a little bit before the precise beginning of Yom Kippur. And like the Mishnah Berurah said, matzah Yom Kippur, we can't be noig heter until a little bit after the precise end of Yom Kippur. Then the Mechaber identified for us, okay, we have to do tosefes Yom Kippur. When does that zman of tosefes Yom Kippur begin? So the Mechaber said it has to begin before Bein Hashmashos. Bein Hashmashos itself is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. And since we're dealing with Isurei Daraisa, Safek Daraisa L'chumra, so certainly we have to be Noyig Isser during Bein Hashmashos. That's not a din of tosefes Yom Kippur. That's Pashut a Safek Isser Daraisa. So the chiyuv of tosefes Yom Kippur is that we have to add on before the onset of Bein Hashmashos. And the Mechaber identified for us, when does Bein Hashmashos begin? Bein Hashmashos begins the amount of time that it takes a person to walk 1,500 amas before nightfall. What is that based on? Well, a mil is 2,000 amas. 1,500 amas is 3/4 of a mil. Now, we know that the time period that it takes to walk a mil, we hold is 18 minutes. That's l'chumra, we hold 18 minutes. There's shittas that range from 18 minutes to 24 minutes, but l'chumra, we say 18 minutes. It takes 18 minutes to walk a mil, and that's 2,000 amas. 3/4 of a mil is 1,500 amas. What's 3/4 of 18? 3/4 of 18 is 13.5 minutes. So based on this Mechaber, we would say that Bein Hashmashos begins when? Approximately 13 and a half minutes before what? The Mechaber said, Koydem Halayla, before the night. That's when Bein Hashmashos begins. So following this Mechaber, we would say like this. We would say that 13 and a half minutes before Laila, before night, which is Tzeis HaKechavim, that's what's already for certain. That's Vaday Laila. Vaday Laila is Tzeis HaKechavim. So the Mechaber is telling me 13 and a half minutes before Tzeis HaKechavim is when Bein Hashmashos begins. Then we have a chiyuv of tosefes Yom Kippur, where we have to be noyeg iser a little bit before that. Now, this is based on the shita of the Mechaber that we learned about already back in Hilchos Shabbos, famous machlokes, the Rabbeinu Tam on one side and the Geonim and the Gra on the other side. When is Bein Hashmashos? When is Shkia? When is Tzeis HaKechavim? We all know Rabbeinu Tam is 72 minutes. What's that based on? What's that based on is like this. The Rabbeinu Tam held that there's such a thing as Tchilas Hashkia and Soif Hashkia. There's the beginning of the Shkia and the end of the Shkia. The beginning of the Shkia, the Tchilas Hashkia, is what we call Shkia, sunset. When, in the words of the Rabbeinu Tam, when the Shemesh is niskasa me'einenu, when we could no longer see the sun, sunset, that's the Tchilas Hashkia. But the Rabbeinu Tam held that Tchilas Hashkia is still considered Yom. That's still Yom. When does Bein Hashmashos start? So, according to the Rabbeinu Tam, Bein Hashmashos begins almost an hour. It begins 3 1/4. Mahalach 3 1/4 mil. So again, Mahalach a mil is 18 minutes. 3 1/4 mil is 18 times 3. 18 times 3 is 54. And then add on another quarter of a mil. So a quarter of 18 is 4.5. So you have 54 plus 4.5 gives you 58 and a half. So according to the Rabbeinu Tam, Bein Hashmashos begins almost an hour after Shkia. 58 and a half minutes after what we call Shkia is the beginning of Bein Hashmashos. Then you have Bein Hashmashos. Bein Hashmashos is 3/4 of a mil. So Bein Hashmashos is another 13 and a half minutes. And that's how you get the famous 72 minutes of Rabbeinu Tam. So again, you have Tchilas Hashkia. Tchilas Hashkia is still Vada Yom. 58 and a half minutes, you still have Vada Yom after Shkia. Then starts Bein Hashmashos. Bein Hashmashos begins then for 13 and a half minutes. And 13 and a half minutes is Tzeis HaKechavim, which is Vada Laila. That's the shita of Rabbeinu Tam. Tzeis HaKechavim is 72 minutes after Shkia. Now, the Mechaber paskins like Rabbeinu Tam. Since the Mechaber paskins like Rabbeinu Tam, what the Mechaber tells me over here in Sif Aleph is, you know when the chiyuv of tosefes Yom Kippur starts? The chiyuv of tosefes Yom Kippur starts a little bit before Ben Hashmoshes. When is Ben Hashmoshes? Ben Hashmoshes is 1500 Amos before Tzeis HaKechavim. Tzeis HaKechavim is 72 minutes after Shkia. 13 and a half minutes earlier, that's when Ben Hashmoshes begins. You need to do tosefes Yom HaKippurim a little bit before that. That's the sheet of the Mechaber based on the Rabbeinu Tam. Now, with that hakdama, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah is cut and base. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber said, when does Ben Hashmoshes begin? Shezmanoi 1500 ama. The time of Ben Hashmoshes begins, the amount of time it takes to walk 1500 amas, Koydem halayla, before night, before Tzeis HaKechavim. Ritzaynor loymar. What the Mechaber wants to say over here is, Sheshir Ben Hashmoshes hu, the time period of Ben Hashmoshes is, Shir mahalach 1500 ama, the amount of time it takes to walk 1500 amas, v'hu le'erech reva shah, which is approximately a quarter of an hour, 15 minutes, Kaidem Tzeis HaKechavim, before Laila, before Tzeis HaKechavim. I gave you the calculation of 13 and a half minutes. The Mishnah Berurah always likes to say it's Be'erech Rev Shah, it's approximately 15 minutes. So if anything, he's going l'chumrah. He's telling you don't count on Ben Hashmoshes beginning 13 and a half minutes before Tzeis. Figure that Ben Hashmoshes already began 15 minutes before Tzeis. And now the Kaidem Lazeh, before this time period, before the onset of Ben Hashmoshes, tzarich la'osif ma'at, you have to add on a little bit of time for tosefes Yom Kippur. V'shir ha-tosefes im Ben Hashmoshes b'yachad. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, and the Mishnah Berurah doesn't really give us a source or an understanding for this. The Mishnah Berurah now tells us v'shir ha-tosefes, the amount of time that you need for tosefes Yom Kippur im Ben Hashmoshes b'yachad, together with the amount of time of Ben Hashmoshes. Now remember, the Mishnah Berurah just told me that the Siman of Ben Hashmoshes is approximately 15 minutes. And we need to do tosefes Yom Kippur before those 15 minutes. Says the Mishnah Berurah, so how much time is that together? How much time before nightfall are you going to have to be noyeg iser for Ben Hashmoshes, which is Safek Yom, Safek Laila, and the chiyuv of tosefes Yom Kippur? Oile kemat chatzi shah. The Mishnah Berurah says that's approximately a half an hour. Now remember, the Mechaber here in Sif Aleph told me that the amount of time that we have to add on for tosefes Yom Kippur, he said, we don't have a fixed amount. He said, tosefes zeh ein lo shiur. We don't have a fixed amount. Just you have to add mechal ala kodesh ma'at oy harbe, a little or a lot. The Mechaber didn't give us amount of time. The Mishnah Berurah tells me over here that the tosefes is approximately the same amount of time as the Ben Hashmoshes. If Ben Hashmoshes is approximately 15 minutes, then the amount of time that you need for tosefes is also approximately 15 minutes. He doesn't give us a source, but in the Sha'ar Tzion, if you take a look at Ois Cotton Bays, he brings this from a Chai Adam. Sha'ar Tzion is Cotton Bays, he brings this from the Chai Adam, and he also says, "Va'ayin b'meshek kasavnu la'il b'simin reish samach aleph in Hilchos Shabbos b'bir halacha dibur hamaschel eizezman," where he goes into this in greater detail, and he tells us where he gets that amount of time from. Now let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "V'hinei ha'shulchan aruch hizkir das Rabbeinu Tam v'siyatoi." This Mechaber is based on the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, like I explained to you. And by giving you the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, the Mechaber over here is going l'shitasai, according to his previously stated opinion in Siman Reish Samach Aleph in Hilchos Shabbos, where the Mechaber paskins like Rabbeinu Tam. Ukvar kasavnu sham, and says the Chavetz Chaim, I already wrote over there in Siman Reish Samach Aleph, Taharbe meharishonim cholkin al zeh, that many Rishonim argue on this Rabbeinu Tam. V'gam hagra, and the Gra also, hiskim l'shitasam, agrees to the opinion of those Rishonim that argue with Rabbeinu Tam. And they say, the Ben Hashmoshes maskil tekef achat tchilas hashkia. These Rishonim hold what we are a little bit more familiar with. They hold, you know when Ben Hashmoshes begins? Ben Hashmoshes begins at Shkia. Remember, according to Rabbeinu Tam, Ben Hashmoshes doesn't begin until almost an hour after Shkia. According to the Gra and these other Rishonim, Ben Hashmashas begins right by Shkia. That's already Safek Yomi, Safek Laila. Once we hit sunset, that's already the beginning of Ben Hashmashas. And then, therefore, it was Zman of tosefes. Then the Zman of tosefes Yom Kippur, shetzarich lahaisif, that we have to add on Mechayil ala Kodesh, hainu Kodim Shkia Sachama. We have to add on tosefes Yom Kippur before Shkia. Not like the Rabbeinu Tam, when tosefes Yom Kippur is way after Shkia. It's almost an hour after Shkia. Ben Hashmashas begins an hour after Shkia came out. We have to back up from that, but it's a long time after Shkia that we have to add on tosefes Yom Kippur, according to Rabbeinu Tam. But according to the Gra and these other Rishonim, tosefes Yom HaKippurim is before Shkia. Vayin Sham Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Chav Gimel. He sends us back to Siman Reish Samach Aleph to the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Chav Gimel Le'inyan Sher Haisafa. What exactly the length of time of this tosefes Shabbos and tosefes Yom Kippur is? Lifrei Shmi Malacha. What is that amount of time that we have to stop doing Malacha? V'hu adin hakal inyan achila. And the same halacha would apply over here when it comes to achila or the other chamisha inuyim. So if you look back over there in Hilchos Shabbos, what the Mishnah Berurah says is, you know how much time you should have for tosefes Shabbos? He says you should wait. You should add on a half hour before Shkia, or al kol panim, at least, he says, shlish shah, 20 minutes. Why does he say that? Because what the Mishnah Berurah says over there is, if you add on a half hour, or at least 20 minutes, you could be yotza all of the shitas of the Rishonim. Because there's another shita that's even more machmir. There's the famous shita of the Ureim. The Ureim holds that Ben Hashmashas is a quarter of an hour, is approximately 15 minutes before Shkia. That's already Safek Yomi, Safek Laila. Now, if Ben Hashmashas is 15 minutes before Shkia, and you have to do tosefes Shabbos before Ben Hashmashas, so that means you need 15 minutes before Shkia for Ben Hashmashas, and 15 minutes before that for tosefes Shabbos. So the Mishnah Berurah over there in Hilchos Shabbos says, if you add on a half hour, or at least 20 minutes, you can be yotza all of the shitas of the Rishonim. So we have the minhag, I think most people add on tosefes Shabbos. When do the women sin licht? The women sin licht 18 minutes, 20 minutes before Shkia. Minhag Yerushalayim, 40 minutes before Shkia. And this is basically what the whole question is based on. Okay, now we go to Sif Beis. Excuse me. Have to keep the throat lubricated. Okay. Sif Beis. So, now that we've established the halacha of tosefes Yom HaKippurim, says the Mechaber here in Sif Beis, Noshim, women, sha'oichlois v'shoisois, who eat and drink, ad shechashecha, all the way until dark. What does that mean, all the way till dark? So if you take a look in the Bir Halacha, Dibur HaMaschel ad shechashecha, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ritzayin Loimar, what the Mechaber means when he says ad shechashecha, he doesn't mean all the way until Tzeisak Yechavim. He means Ritzayin Loimar ad bein hashmashas. He's talking over here about women who don't know the halacha of tosefes Yom HaKippurim, and therefore they eat and they drink all the way up until bein hashmashas. We said you need tosefes Yom HaKippurim before bein hashmashas. Ben Hashmashas is Safek Yom, Safek Laila, Safek Daraisa. These women aren't aware of the halacha of tosefes Yom HaKippurim, and therefore they eat all the way up to Ben Hashmashas. Let's say all the way up to Shkia. Aval Ben Hashmashas, says the Chavetz Chaim in the Bir Halacha, the Mechaber can't mean Ben Hashmashas, then certainly you would have to castigate these women and tell them that they cannot eat. The Kimafurish B'Taradam Yeshu Safek Karis. We will be talking about a Safek Daraisa of a Safek Krisus. So certainly here in Sif Beis, the Mechaber does not mean women who are eating all the way up until Ben Hashmashas. So now let's see again, Sif Beis. Women who eat and drink all the way up to Shkia, all the way up to Ben Hashmashas, because they're not familiar with the halacha of tosefes Yom HaKippurim. They don't know this halacha. They don't know that there's a mitzvah that requires them to be ma'aseh mechayil ala kodesh. Says the Mechaber, Ein memachin biyadon, you should not castigate them, you should not give them reproof, kedei shelo yavayu la'asois bizadon, so that they shouldn't go ahead and eat bemezid during that time. They don't know the halacha of tosefes Yom Kippur. You're going to go yell at them and tell them that what they're doing is wrong. They might not be makabelit from you. They're not going to accept what you're saying. They never heard of this halacha. Now they're going to go ahead and they're going to eat during that time b'mezid. So that means that b'mezid they're going to be mevatel this mitzvah saseh of tosefes Yom Kippurim. Says the Mechaber, we don't want that to happen. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah is cut and gimel. Very important Mishnah Berurah. Ein memachin biyadon. The Mishnah Berurah said you should not castigate. The Mechaber said you should not castigate them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'dafka biyodeya bivadai shelo yikablu mimenu. When is this halacha true? That the Mechaber says that you should not castigate them. That's when you know for certain that if you go over to them and you tell them, hey, what you're doing is wrong, you're not allowed to eat now because of tosefes Yom Kippurim, you know that they're not going to listen to you. Avol b'safek shema yikablu. But if you at least have a doubt that they might accept your words and they might listen to you, sarich limchais, then you have to be moicha. Afilu memidi derabanan. And this would be true even by an issa derabanan. You see somebody being over on an issa derabanan, if you have a doubt that if you tell them, hey, what you're doing is usher, they might accept it from you, you have to be moicha. When the Mechaber says over here that there is a concept of mutav sheyushaygin v'alti mezidin, that you should not give somebody reproof because he might not accept it from you, and you'd rather he does it b'shaygin than b'mezid, that's only when you know for sure that he's not going to accept it from you. But if there's a doubt that he might accept it from you, then certainly you have to be moicha. Now there's a very interesting sharitzian over here, sharitzian ois cotton gimel. Sorry, seasonal allergies. Says the Chavetz Chaim here in the Sharitzion is Cut and Gimel. He brings this down from the Magen Avram b'shem Arash, the Magen Avram in the name of the Rosh. V'kein muchach miperik b'ameh behema taf nun hey amid aleph, a Gemara in Shabbos, a very interesting Gemara of a story over there between different Amoraim and things that were going on in the home of the Reish Galusa, and they had a whole discussion whether or not they should be moicha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, and he brings this down from the Tashbats. V'ilu hinachnu b'nei Adam. If we would leave people alone, and we would leave them to their own devices, al ma sheshoygin b'chol yom, with things that they're doing b'shoygig on a daily basis, hayu moisifich gagos, people are slowly but surely going to forget halacha, and they're going to do more things wrong b'shoygig, and more things wrong b'shoygig, and more things wrong b'shoygig. V'tipal HaTorah mat chas v'shalom, and chas v'chalila the Torah will be forgotten. In other words, what the Tashbat says is, hold it. Are you going to tell me that there's a hard, fast rule that whenever you see somebody doing something wrong out of ignorance, you should not go ahead and give him reproof because mutav sheyushaygin v'alti mezid? So you see somebody being over on Isurei Daraisa, you see somebody being over on all sorts of Isurim because he doesn't know better, but you're not going to say anything to him. Because if you tell him something, so then he might do it b'mezid. So mutav sheyushaygin v'alti mezid. So you're never going to teach anybody to be parish from Isurim. So what's going to happen? This guy is going to keep on doing Isurim. Then he's going to meet somebody else who's doing even more Isurim. He's going to learn that more Isurim are mutter, and more Isurim are mutter, and this one's going to learn from this one, and that one's going to learn from that one, etc., etc., etc. And eventually, chas v'chalila, the Torah will be forgotten. So you can't say that there's a hard, fast rule. Mutter sheyushaygin v'alti mezid. Oid Kosav Sham, continues the Sharitzion. The Tashbats also writes, the Niraloi Shazad Dover like Nemar Ela B'Shenisrabu Harbe Shaygin B'Dover. This concept of Mutav Shaygin V'Alti Mezidin, first of all, again, it's only when you know for certain that they're not going to accept what you're saying. Second of all, it's only when a lot of people are doing this same thing b'shaygig. So it's widespread, and that's why they're not going to accept it from you. Aval B'Dover Sharak Miyutan Shaygin. But if it's something that most people know it's aser, and there's just a few people that are doing it wrong, mitzvah limchais b'yadam. It's a mitzvah to tell them that what they're doing is wrong. I remember when I was young, when I was young and I was growing up and Amaratzis was rampant, we did all sorts of things on Shabbos that I know now are Isurim. And Baruch Hashem, we found out. People came, my older brothers, they went to yeshiva, they went to learn Baruch Moshe, they came home, they said, no, you're not allowed to open up a can of soda on Shabbos. No, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. We had no idea. We had no idea that there were Isurim involved in a lot of things. Who knew? So Baruch Hashem, they came and they taught us. Otherwise, Hilchos Shabbos would be forgotten. If it's something that only a few people are doing wrong, of course you have to point out to them that what they're doing is wrong. You have to teach them. If you're not going to go ahead and teach, so what's going to happen is these practices that people are doing wrong are going to become widespread and nobody's going to teach them otherwise. And as far as the posek, if the teacher, if the posek, if the rav will go try to teach people that what they're doing is wrong and they don't listen to him, Allah Nemar, on him the pasuk in Yechezkel says, V'ata es nafshecha hitzalta, at least you saved your own nefesh. Ad kam l'shaynai. In other words, to the Moira Hira, we tell them, don't worry if they're not going to listen to you. At least you did what was upon you. At least you went and you were moicha. Okay, so what do we have over here so far in Sif Beis? So far over here in Sif Beis, we have the concept. You have women who don't know this halacha of tosefes Yom HaKippurim. Says the Mechaber, if you see that they're eating all the way up to Ben Hashmoshes, don't go ahead and correct them. Why? Mutav sheyushaygin valti mezidin. And the Mishnah Berurah told us over here in Ice Cut and Gimel, from this Magen Avram, that this only applies if you know that they're not going to listen. But if there's at least a suffix that they might listen, then you should go ahead and you should be moicha. That's what we see so far. Now let's go to the Ramah, 3 lines from the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch. Hago. V'hu adin b'chol dvar iser. Says the Ramah, this concept of mutav sheyushaygin valti mezidin, it doesn't only apply over here to this halacha of tosefes Yom Kippurim. V'hu adin b'chol dvar iser. We always say this by any isurim. Amrinan mutav sheyushaygin v'lo yehi mezidin. We always apply this concept. Right away, says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and dalid. V'hu adin b'chol dvar iser. Ritzaynai loymar. What the Ramah means to say is, Gam kein kishabaru loy shelo yekablu mimenu v'chanal. Again, this Ramah that applies the concept of mutav sheyushaygin valti mezidin to all isurim in the Torah is again only speaking about cases where you know that they're not going to be makabel from you. But if you think that they might be makabel from you, then you have to be moicha. And the Chavetz Chaim says that there's no difference between a rabbim and a yochid when it comes to this halacha. Ice cut and hay. Amrin on mutav sheyushaygin ritzaynai loymar. Whoops, I skipped. Continues the Chavetz Chaim in Ice cut and hay. The chol zeh dafka b'sha'achshav heim shaygigin. Also, this concept that you should not give reproof because of mutav sheyushaygin valti mezidin is only if the person that you're seeing doing an iser is taka doing it b'shaygig. Havel kishayoydin shu aser roivin memezid. If you see somebody doing something b'shat nefesh, he's doing it b'mezid, tzarich lo yichicham. Then of course you have to give them teichacha. Af kishabar lo shelo yikablu. Even if you know for a fact that they're not going to listen. Because what? It's not mutav sheyushaygin valti mezidin. He's doing it b'mezid. So he's doing it b'mezid. Go be moicha. Tell him you're not allowed to do what you're doing. Unehi demi she'ena mechiach ena nena shavor chetam. It's true that if somebody does not give teichacha, he's not going to get an einish for the fact that he didn't give teichacha. Kevin shabar lo shelo yikablu, since he knows he's not going to listen to him anyway. Nevertheless, it's a mitzvah to go be mechiach. Continues the Ramah, 2 lines from the bottom, in the middle of the line. V'dafka she'ena mefarish b'Torah. This concept of mutav sheyushaygin valti mezidin is only by halachas that are not written beferish in the Torah Hakdosha. Afal pishu daraisa, even if it's a din daraisa. For example, this din of tosefes Yom Kippurim. We said that this din of tosefes Yom Kippurim is learnt out from a pasuk. So if it's learnt out from a pasuk, it's a din daraisa. But it's not mefurish in the Torah. It's only learnt out from a drasha. start down from a drasha, but tisha be'erev. It's not meforish in the Torah. It's not clear cut in the pasuk that you're mechuyev to make tosefes Yom Kippurim. It's only if you learn the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, you know the drasha. But it's not meforish in the Torah like it is. Let's say that you have to eat in the sukkah and you have to take a lulav and esrog. Aval in meforish b'Torah, when we speak about a halacha that's mamish written beferish in the Torah, moichin biyadan, then you do have to be moicha. Why? Because then you don't say mutav shiur v'alti mezidin. If something is mefurish in the pasuk, we don't say that the guy is a shaygig. He's not a shaygig. How can he be a shaygig? It's mefurish in the Torah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Vav, she'eina mefurish b'Torah. We can only say this concept of mutav shiur v'alti mezidin when something is mefurish in the pasuk. We're saying a loymar. If something is not beferish in the pasuk, then we could look at this guy or this woman who's eating up to Banish Pashas, and we could say she's a shaygig. In this, that they won't listen to us, they don't know it. It's killed to them. To them, it's very lenient. But something that's mamish written in the pasuk, and they're going against what it says in the pasuk, then the Ramah is saying certainly they're not a shaygig. Then we have to be moicha and we have to punish them until they're pirish from the Isser. Now the Haitik of Paiskim say that unfortunately this may not apply nowadays. Nowadays we can have people that are shaygigin even on what it says beferish in the pasuk. They could still be shaygigin. Back in the days of the Ramah was saying if it's beforish in the pasuk, they can't be a shaygig. Everybody knows basic chumash. Everybody knows basic what it says in the pasuk. The Paiskim say nowadays that's not necessarily true. If it's beforish in the Torah, you have to be moicha. Dafka with the lekas sakana, says the Chavetz Chaim, this is only true as long as by being moicha you're not going to put yourself in danger. If by being moicha they might physically attack you, they might come to you with violence, you're not mechuyev to put yourself in danger. And so says the Sefer HaChinuch, mitzvah reish lamed tes ayin shah. And for further research, he sends us v'ayin b'choshen mishpat siman yud beis or b'yardea siman shin lamed dalet. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue with the rest of the Ramah Yis Hashem tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be mengen against Klal Yisrael. For Rosh Hashem should send Yeshuas, for Fuas, and Parnasa to all those in need. And we should be zeicher to see the Biyas Gerel Tzedek. B'meherev Yameinu. Amen. Be well.